Age 62, animal-based for 2 years. Calcium heart scan score is 0. This is a review from Paul H. on our beef organ supplement from Heart and Soil Supplements. Hey, Dr. Paul, I've been animal-based for 2 years, taking your beef organ supplements for a year now. And at age 62, I feel unstoppable. My annual blood work I got a few months ago showed my total cholesterol of 210. Oh my God. LDL of 157, which are above the normal range. My doctor said I should think about taking a statin. So just to make sure he was wrong about that, I got a CT calcium heart scan. I got the results today. My score was, wait for it, 0. That's after 2 years of eating red meat twice a day. A score of 0 is also almost unheard of for a 62-year-old male. My father also had a heart attack, died from a failed heart. So it is not that I have good, quote, genes. It's the diet and supplements. I'm a little worried now. I may outlive my kids unless they get on an animal-based diet. Certainly, I hope Paul doesn't. Well, there's no good way to really phrase that statement. I hope all of Paul's family is healthy for as long as they want to live. But how cool that Paul's an example of somebody living into their 60s, eating red meat twice a day, taking beef organs from Heart and Soil Supplements, thriving, calcium score of 0. That's the way we do it. Atherosclerosis is not related to LDL number. It's related to insulin sensitivity. I talk about this a ton in this podcast, but takeaway from this is that beef organs, heart, liver, kidney, spleen, and pancreas, freeze-dried, grass-fed, grass-finished, the finest desiccated organs on the planet in glass, because plastic bottles are bullshit, is available from Heart and Soil Supplements, heartandsoil.co. If you're not getting organs, get them in your life. They will up your game for sure. Get them fresh. If you don't want to do that, get them desiccated. Check us out at Heart and Soil Supplements on Instagram, heartandsoil.co. Reclaim your birthright to optimal health, my people. In today's podcast, I talk about my blood work, appropriately enough. I had blood work recently while I was in Virginia, and I go into all of it in great detail. At times, this podcast gets a little technical, but if you're not ready for that, just go slow and pause it when you need to. I go over my previous blood work from a few years ago. I go back to when I was carnivore 4 years ago, and I talk about pros, cons of an animal-based diet. I talk about what's good, what's bad, what even I can improve on as I'm traveling with my blood work. And I think you guys will learn a lot from this one. This is not medical advice. None of the podcasts are, but I like to back up what I say about this way of eating, any way of eating, and show my blood work to illustrate that it is all real. As I've said in the past, I'm now 45 freaking years old, no drugs, no hormones, never have taken those, and thriving with all of that. My testosterone is good. My fasting insulin is very low. You guys can see all of my blood work in this podcast. Enjoy this one. This is a podcast that I have wanted to do for quite some time now. I have wanted to go get blood work and then share with you guys the updated blood work results. I've been getting blood work on myself for many years. As you will see, this dates back to medical school. Almost 10 years ago, I've been getting routine blood work. So I'll try and take you guys through it. I won't really belabor the very old blood work, but I'll use it as a reference in some of the lab assays just for context. But mostly I will discuss my recent blood work, which I just got a couple of weeks ago when I was in the United States. So late June 2022. The previous set of blood work was from late 2020, I believe. So it was a little less than 2 years. So it was too long, but I was doing a lot of traveling and didn't have time to get new blood work. So I've been doing different things with my diet, but for that entire time between the most recent set of blood work and this set of blood work, I've been animal-based. So the context for this blood work discussion is what I'm doing now with my diet. I think that's why people are interested in knowing what my blood work is. I eat organs. I eat them fresh or I eat them desiccated, like from Heart and Soil Supplements. I eat meat, about 2 pounds a day. I have a few ounces of different organs, heart, liver, that type of thing, testicle, bone marrow. I have fruit. So this is a new addition relative to my previous blood work discussions when I was strictly carnivore. So I have probably 200 plus grams of carbohydrates per day now from fruit and honey. So I'll discuss how that affects my blood sugars, how that affects my insulin sensitivity, how that affects my lipids, which is a very interesting conversation in this podcast, but that's what I'm doing. You can see all what I eat every day, or at least what I eat for breakfast and some dinners on my Instagram stories at carnivoremd 2.0. I pretty much record it every single day. So I have organs, I have meat, I have fruit, I have honey, and I have raw dairy, which I've been doing for probably about the last 6 to 7 months. I have raw butter. Occasionally I have raw cheese. I have raw milk from goats and cows, which I ferment into kefir. So that is the baseline. I don't eat bread. I don't eat vegetables. I don't eat grains. I don't eat beans. I don't eat starches. And those are the things that I leave out of my diet. So hopefully this will be interesting for you guys. Any discussion of blood work. I think this is the second or third podcast I've done since I started the podcast talking about my blood work. Any of these discussions are very technical, so bear with me. I'll try and break it down, but this is a technical subject matter. If people want to understand why I feel the way I do about my lipids or about various other aspects of my labs, there's some technicalities there because there are red, quote unquote, parts to my blood work that the mainstream medical establishment would flag. Most of it looks pretty darn good right now, but a few things get flagged, like lipids, which I'll start with in one moment. And I want to explain to you guys why I think that these are not a big deal and why I think the context matters. I've done many podcasts on lipids. I even did a podcast maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago on cholesterol, what it is, and how I think about it. So refer back to that one if you get lost in the forthcoming lipid discussion here about my blood work specifically. Again, I'm a physician. My diploma is behind me there from the University of Arizona. Did my residency at the University of Washington. Board certified, doubly board certified. One of those board certifications is in nutrition. There's really no great formal training for nutrition for physicians, so you have to get postgraduate training, and I've done lots of reading about research papers. There are lots of people who are going to disagree with my assessment of various aspects of my labs, so I welcome that conversation. If you don't think that my assessment of my labs is correct, then put something in the comments or reach out to me on Instagram or So I think that there's a lot to be said about this, but I think that the important takeaway from the whole discussion is that labs might look a little different when we're eating a lot of meat, a lot of saturated fat from animals. And the context is critically important. I say that all the time, but what I mean by that is that if you are insulin sensitive, I think that a lot of things change, and many portions of blood work get interpreted by well-meaning, intelligent physicians as if they are in a population of people who is massively insulin resistant. So yeah, for the run-of-the-mill physician seeing patients, for a physician, for a doctor seeing patients that just walking off the street, if they had some of the blood markers, specifically the LDL that I have, they might be concerned about their cardiovascular risk, but that person is insulin resistant. So we'll get into that in one moment. I think there's a hugely important thing to be aware of here, because so many of us, when we choose to eat an animal-based diet, increase the amount of red meat and organs in our diet, increase the amount of animal fats with good saturated fats like stearic acid and 18 carbon saturated fat that I've talked about a lot, odd chain fatty acids, pentadecanoic acid, heptadecanoic acid, which are found predominantly in animal foods. These are beneficial for humans. When we do those things, often our LDL cholesterol goes up and a few other things change slightly on our blood work. Mainstream physicians get worried about that. And part of the work that I do is this clarion call to those mainstream physicians to open their eyes just a little bit wider to the fact that context matters. And perhaps we should be asking the question, is LDL, are a few of these other metrics something to worry about if you are insulin sensitive? With that in mind, I think every blood panel should have a fasting insulin, a fasting glucose. Hemoglobin A1C is a little bit more challenging metric because it can vary, but I want to show you that. But I want to start with those things to show you the context of my lipid panel. If your physician is not getting a fasting insulin, they're usually going to get fasting glucose. They may get hemoglobin A1C, but only if you're diabetic or pre-diabetic. If they're not getting a fasting insulin, they are missing the entire context of your blood work results. I'll say that I ordered pretty much the best panel that I could get from Wellness FX. I have no affiliation with them. I'm actually not sure they're the best purveyor out there for this type of thing. I think that one of the current sponsors, Merrick Health, is a telehealth company, and the panel that they set me up with is even a little bit more comprehensive than what I got from Wellness FX. So if you want to get your own blood work, check out Merrick. This is not a paid thing. I just think they do a great job. And I think there are physicians there that can help walk you through it as well. So without further ado, let's dive into my labs. Again, I'm going to get to all of these during this podcast. I did lipids, I did hormones, I did inflammatory markers, I did thyroid, I did iron studies. I've got pretty much very comprehensive panel, but this is the most important piece of any blood work, I think, to set the context. You must know the framework of any blood work before you are thinking about it. So insulin, fasting insulin, mine is 2.4. Okay. IGF-1 is 112. And if we look up, I can show you my fasting glucose, which I believe was 79 with a hemoglobin A1C of 5.2. So this is actually probably where I should start. Insulin, fasting insulin 2.4, hemoglobin A1C 5.2, fasting blood sugar 79. And then you can take the fasting insulin and the fasting glucose and calculate a HOMA-IR score. It's just a calculated indicator of insulin resistance. These are all very, very good in my opinion. I don't think anyone would debate that I'm extremely insulin sensitive, that my fasting blood sugar is exemplary, and my hemoglobin A1C of 5.2 reflects an average blood sugar of 103 milligrams per deciliter over the last 90 days. Hemoglobin A1C is a measure of the average blood sugar over the last 93 days. You can see my fasting blood sugar in the morning was 79. And so this is important. So what do I want to talk about here? I want to note that with a massive amount, quote unquote, of fruit and honey in my diet, I remain extremely insulin sensitive. I don't think anyone would argue this. There are people on the keto side who would say honey is bad for you. And hopefully I'll be able to have conversations with them in the near future and talk it out in an interesting way. But I disagree. I think there's lots of good evidence that honey is great for humans. I've shown it many times on the podcast previously. And people would also say fruit is bad. It's going to raise your blood sugar. Well, of course, it's going to raise your blood sugar after you eat it postprandially. But I think that the real problem that people are pointing at here is, are you insulin resistant? And no, I am not insulin resistant. In my case, and I think in all cases of Homo sapiens, eating fruit and eating honey will not make you insulin resistant in any way, shape, or form. These foods should not be eaten at the exclusion of other foods, which are also valuable parts of the human diet that are nutrient rich, like meat and organs and animal fats. You should not become a fruitarian, but I think having some fruit and honey in your diet are great sources of carbohydrates and will improve your performance, whether you're doing jujitsu, whether you're surfing, whether you're running, whether you're sprinting, whether you're lifting weights. This, I think, is the key. One of the key things that I learned in my journey from carnivore strictly to animal-based, that adding carbohydrates in improved my hormones, as you'll see, my thyroid, my testosterone. It improved my muscle cramps. It improved my mental clarity. It improved cardiac issues like heart palpitations, which are related to electrolyte issues. It improved so many things. And my fasting insulin actually probably went down. My fasting blood sugar went down when I added carbohydrates. I think I have a fasting blood sugar from when I was on carnivore. They're usually high 90s or 100s because there is some physiologic insulin resistance, which is different than pathologic insulin resistance that develops when we are on a ketogenic diet. These are the reasons that I am not a fan of ketogenic diets. I don't think that they serve us well long-term as humans. I've talked about this many, many times, and hopefully I'll be able to do a podcast exclusively on that topic. Fasting insulin should be less than 5 micro IU per ml. Again, mine was 2.4. I believe the median for the American population is 9. If you look at this blood work, you'll see that if I click on this insulin, it says low risk is less than 9. That is bullshit. This reference range is way too big. Moderate risk is 9 to 24. Look, if you are a 6, a 7, an 8, or a 9, that's not good. You do not want to be that insulin resistant. A 24, that's massively insulin resistant. Anything above a 9 to 24, that's extremely insulin resistant. This reference range should be much tighter. I think it would change the face of medicine as we know it today. But start with a fasting insulin, then triangulate it with a fasting glucose, get a hemoglobin A1C. If you want to know what your average blood sugar over the last 3 months has been, or wear a continuous glucose monitor from a company like NutriSense. I've done multiple podcasts with Kara, a dietitian from NutriSense, talking about how to interpret your continuous blood glucose monitor findings. But this is the most important piece of this blood work, is to show you guys the context. I am insulin sensitive and I eat a shitload of fruit and a lot of honey per day. How much? Well, you can watch my stories on Instagram, but today I think I've eaten an entire papaya. I've eaten close to an entire pineapple, and I've probably had 3 to 4 tablespoons of honey already today, and I haven't even eaten dinner. Now, dinner will probably be another 50 to 75 grams of carbohydrates, but that's a lot of carbohydrates that I've already ingested. Yes, my postprandial after meal blood sugar is going to go up, but I don't worry about that. I remain insulin sensitive. Insulin is a valuable hormone. Having an after meal, a postprandial spike in your insulin does so many good things for your body. It helps your body conserve minerals. It helps your body conserve electrolytes. This is why people on long-term ketogenic diets often run into recalcitrant electrolyte deficiencies, and no amount of salt or electrolyte supplementation will correct them. I've seen this over and over and over. Giving your body some insulin is a good thing. Insulin is not the enemy in this situation. And I think that you can eat a lot of raw honey and a lot of fruit and not develop insulin-induced insulin resistance. This, unfortunately, I think is where many in the ketogenic field go wrong in their thinking. They believe that more insulin is always bad. You should have your insulin as low as possible all the time. I think that is wrong. I think phasic, right, postprandial, after you eat, pulses of insulin are healthy and essential for optimal human health. You want to spike your insulin after a meal. You want it to come down very low, which is a reflection of your overall insulin sensitivity. Hopefully that makes sense. What causes pathological insulin resistance? Seed oils and processed sugars. I think that can lead to some degree of insulin-induced insulin resistance, but also metabolic insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction through more complex mechanisms that are beyond the scope of this podcast. But when we look at my hormones, especially my testosterone and my sex hormone binding globulin, I will again reference the importance of having some insulin spikes for sex hormone binding globulin. With all of that in mind, let's move on to look at my lipids. A little bit of red here, but there's some interesting history that I want to show you guys as well. Total cholesterol, 246 milligrams per deciliter. LDL, 164 milligrams per deciliter. This is the lowest LDL that I've had probably in the last 4 plus years. When I was on a strict carnivore diet and zero carbohydrate diet, my LDL went to 400 milligrams per deciliter. I'm not convinced that's a bad thing. I think it has to do with human lipid metabolism and energy metabolism, which I'll talk about in a moment. I've remained insulin sensitive throughout that entire time. And my HDL is now 65. My triglycerides are 65 for a triglyceride to HDL ratio of 1. And that is actually a very valuable set of lipids. You don't need to get an MR. You don't need particle counts, in my opinion. I think really what you need to know is just these things. I think that LDL is a very poor predictor of cardiovascular risk. And as I will talk about in a moment, I think that the context by which you are viewing that LDL is the most important piece of it. And that elevated, quote unquote, LDL is not necessarily a problem if you are insulin sensitive, though many in the lipid space will provide study after study to say, look, there's a very strong relationship between LDL and cardiovascular disease. And then they will leave out the studies that show that relationship between LDL and cardiovascular disease is attenuated massively in people who are insulin sensitive. One way you can tell that you're insulin sensitive, one proxy, is a high HDL and low triglycerides. I talked about this on the Joe Rogan Experience a couple of years ago. I showed Framingham study data looking at different levels of HDL as a stratification for LDL and cardiovascular risk. What you saw was that people with the highest levels of HDL had essentially no relationship between LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular risk. HDL in that situation was a proxy for insulin sensitivity, or low HDL being a proxy for insulin resistance. But you can see that my HDL remains high, my triglycerides remain low, and my triglyceride to HDL ratio is 1. That's where it's kind of stayed throughout my history. When my HDL goes up, my triglycerides are often a little higher, but it's stayed in this range throughout my history. If you guys have followed me for some time, you know that when I went on Joe's podcast, I talked about an LDL of 500. I want to show you guys that one. That was actually my last blood work, though I've had a couple of finger stick lipid panels since then that showed the LDL declining. Now, at that time, I was eating honey. And interestingly, I think that LDL may have also been related to a very strenuous workout that I did a few days before I got that blood work. So this is my blood work from July 2020. So 2 years ago. I'll get to the hormones later. The cholesterol, you can see there, the total cholesterol was 647, triglycerides 108, HDL 90, LDL cholesterol 533. Again, I was eating honey at the time, so I'm not quite sure why the LDL was so massively high. I was not eating a lot of fruit at this time, just honey. You can see that the LDL particle count was high. Small LDL, which I'll talk about in a moment, was very high. My LDL size was massive. I've never seen somebody with an LDL of 24.7 nanometers. But as I will mention more in a moment, I actually don't think small particles and LDL size are much of a cardiovascular disease risk marker when you are insulin sensitive, or they're just an indicator that you might be insulin resistant in a lot of people, but doesn't work that way for everyone. So I have a lot of LDL particles because I have a lot of LDL. They're big LDL. And so big LDL gives you a large LDL milligram per deciliter number, but I still have a lot of LDL particles because that number was so big. Again, I'm not exactly sure why that number was so big at the time because I was eating carbohydrates, but I think that when many people saw that, they attacked me saying I had familial hyperlipidemia. In the cholesterol podcast from a few weeks ago, I went into more detail about familial hypercholesterolemia. I do not have familial hypercholesterolemia. I've had LDLs that are much lower. I've had LDLs in the 140s or even the 120s in the past. And this LDL is 164, eating carbohydrates and fruit and honey. So there's really no evidence that I have familial hypercholesterolemia at all. But what I did have was one instance where my LDL went very high when I was eating honey exclusively. It may have been related to something else. Nevertheless, the LDL came down. The cholesterol is very variable and will be affected based on when you last ate. They were both fasting blood draws and also what is in your diet. So what do we know about LDL? We know that when you are eating more saturated fat, LDL tends to go up a little bit, not to 500, but LDL does go up a little bit when you're eating saturated fat, which is probably why my LDL is 164 now. When you eat seed oils, your LDL goes down, but as I'll show you guys later in the podcast, and I've shown this study many times, when you eat seed oils, your LDL goes down, but your LP little a, which is essentially a measure of oxidized phospholipids as well as oxidized LDL, which is a direct measure of oxidized phospholipids on LDL. Those both go up when you eat seed oil. So I think that using LDL as a metric of cardiovascular risk is short-sighted and myopic. And that is basically what I'll say about that. I don't think it's something to worry about. If you are insulin sensitive, you must get that fasting insulin. But how many of these doctors who are worried about your slightly elevated or moderately elevated LDL on an animal-based diet are getting a fasting insulin? I think all too few, unfortunately. So let's go back to my lipid panel here. You can see that, of course, they're going to say my non-HDL cholesterol is low. That's just a calculated number. And then I got an NMR. So you can see here, my ApoB is also going to be high because my LDL is high. And as you know, if you listen to the Lipids cholesterol podcast I did a few weeks ago, ApoB is on LDL, also VLDL and other apolipoproteins. So this is just reflecting the fact that I have a quote high LDL. Again, I don't worry about that. I'll come back to the LP little a in a moment. My peak LDL size is smaller now, 218.1. Again, when I look into LDL size, what I find is that when you adjust for insulin sensitivity, LDL size is simply a metric, a predictor of increased cardiovascular risk because it predicts insulin resistance. They're saying my LDL size is too low, but you can see here that I missed the cutoff by 0.1 angstroms. So they would probably put me in the moderate range of peak LDL size. But again, as an insulin sensitive individual, I think that the value of an LDL size goes out the window because we know that I am insulin sensitive. There's no risk of insulin resistance when I have a fasting insulin of 2.4 and a hemoglobin A1C of 5.2. So the LDL particles, this is actually a number in nanomole per liter. This is counting the number of particles rather than this LDL number, which is milligrams per deciliter, the 164 versus 1925 LDL particles. Again, it's going to be high because I have high, quote unquote, LDL milligrams per deciliter. I don't care. My LDL phenotype is pattern A. I want to talk about that as well in a moment, but that means that the majority of my particles are large and buoyant. And again, this LDL phenotype is mostly an indicator of insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity. So there's a lot of redundancy in these things. And if you are insulin sensitive, meaning, in my opinion, fasting insulin of less than 5, preferably less than 3, none of this really matters. I think that there's very scant. I don't think there's a good case that can be made with the literature to suggest that your LDL is an increased cardiovascular risk when you are insulin sensitive. It's going to say that I have small LDL that's high and medium LDL that's high. But again, this is just because I have a large number of LDL particles, and every distribution, every human has a semi-Gaussian, which is a bell curve distribution of LDL particles. Some are going to be small, some are going to be medium, and some are going to be large. And so if you have more LDL particles, you're probably going to trigger the flag on almost every blood work saying that you have increased small dense LDL. But again, when you look at insulin sensitivity first, none of these numbers mean much of anything. And this is all to say that, in my strong opinion, and I would love to debate and have a reasonable conversation with anyone about this, I have an LDL pattern of A, I'm very insulin sensitive, and I don't think there's any increased or any case to be made for an increased cardiovascular risk with a small LDL or a medium LDL here. You can see ApoA1, which is the apolipoprotein, on HDL. They're flagging my large HDL, saying it's low. Again, I'm right at the top of their range. I missed it by a very small amount. I think that this is, again, something I wouldn't worry about at all because I'm super insulin sensitive. So that is basically my summary of my lipid panel. There's a little bit of history there that I discussed as well, but I want to dive into a little bit more of the context there. I don't want to rehash the lipid episode that I did for fear this will become an onerous podcast on my blood work. I don't want it to be a 3-hour podcast, but I think it's important to consider that hyperinsulinemia is an independent risk factor for ischemic heart disease. And if you look at the relative risks in a lot of these studies, hyperinsulinemia is by far the best predictor of ischemic heart disease, much better predictor than LDL. And yet everyone just focuses on LDL, and very few people are looking at hyperinsulinemia as a contextual variable here. And studies like this are critically important not to ignore. February 12, 2001 from JAMA, low triglycerides, high density lipoprotein, cholesterol, and the risk of ischemic heart disease. I talked about this study before. So men with conventional risk factors for ischemic heart disease, this would probably be an elevated LDL, have a low risk of ischemic heart disease if they have low triglycerides and high HDL-C levels. That's what people like Dave Feldman would call the triad, a triad of metabolic health. And when you look at those people, you really cannot make an argument that they are at increased risk of cardiovascular disease with their quote unquote elevated LDL. And I will say this to be very clear. I think being myopically focused on LDL is a mistake that is harming people. They get put on statins, they get put on other lipid lowering drugs, and they remove some of the most nutrient-rich foods in their diet. So why does LDL go up on these type of diets? As I hinted at earlier, I think there are 2 major reasons that your LDL may rise on an animal-based diet. It's important to note that an animal-based diet includes carbohydrates, and the new Carnivore MD website is going to be up very soon. It's carnivoremd.com. Right now, it's still the old one, but on the new one, we're going to have a calculator. Okay. We're going to have a calculator to help you guys get macros, just a basic framework for structuring an animal-based diet in terms of your macros, how many carbohydrates, et cetera. So an animal-based diet has carbohydrates, but a lot of people do phases where they have low carbohydrates. Again, I'm not a fan of this, but I think there's some good evidence that when you do a low carbohydrate diet, there is a rise in LDL due to the metabolism of lipids and something called the lipid energy models. This is an interesting paper. It's an opinion paper, a hypothesis paper published by Dave Feldman and a few others from May of 2022. My friend Tommy Wood contributed this paper as well. But basically, if you read this paper, what you will find is that the main contributor here is that there is energy. And if you are fueled by fat, meaning you don't have a lot of carbohydrates coming into your system, there is an increased efflux, meaning an export of VLDL containing particles from the liver, and that's going to lead to a higher LDL. So I think that there's some really interesting correlations that happen, and you can show this, and Dave's work has shown this pretty clearly, that when you decrease carbohydrates, your LDL will go up. Now, this is probably an evolutionary adaptation to ketogenic diets for humans. Certainly, we had periods where hunts were unsuccessful, where we couldn't find honey or fruit. This is part of the ketogenic physiology. I don't think it's a negative thing. You're going to remain insulin sensitive, but this explains part of the rise. I would say the majority of the rise in LDL in many humans is that they have low carbohydrates in their diet. So if you are seeing LDLs of 300 or 400 milligrams per deciliter in your blood work, chances are you're low carbohydrate or you're very low carbohydrate. You're getting less than 100 grams of carbohydrates a day. So increase your carbohydrates and your LDL will come down. I've seen that pattern for myself. Now, my LDL remains 164, which is perhaps 20% higher than most people would like to see it. And I think that has to do with saturated fat, and something called the homeoviscous model, I think, is the most compelling hypothesis that I have seen for that thus far. I've spoken about the homeoviscous model in the past. Basically, the high-level explanation is that your cell membranes must maintain a standard, a homeostatic level of fluidity. We know that placing cholesterol into cell membranes makes them more fluid. Removing cholesterol from cell membranes makes them less fluid. So when you eat lots of saturated fat, what happens in your cell membranes? That saturated fat gets incorporated into your cell membranes. Saturated fat in membranes makes them rigid. So you're probably going to have to put a little more cholesterol in those membranes to keep the fluidity at a homeostatic level. What happens when you eat polyunsaturated fatty acids? Those get incorporated into your cell membranes too. That's a bad thing, I think, because those get stuck in your cell membranes, and it takes humans and human physiology a long time to get those polyunsaturated fatty acids out of those cell membranes. But those membranes become fluid because the polyunsaturated fatty acids have kinked tails, which creates a space demand in the membrane, which makes the membrane more fluid. And that leads to a removal of cholesterol from the membranes and a decrease in LDL, probably in your bloodstream and your body. Now, again, I don't think that's a problem. I don't think LDL is a good risk factor for cardiovascular disease if you are insulin sensitive. But as I hinted at, and as I'll show you guys now, what we know is that when you increase polyunsaturated fatty acids and you decrease saturated fatty acids, what happens? Your LDL might go down, but your Lp(a) and your oxidized LDL go up. That is a bad thing, and I think that is missed by people over and over and over. This study should be pasted on a billboard. Sometimes people say, what would you put on a billboard? I would put this freaking study on a billboard. Changes in dietary fat intake alter plasma levels of oxidized low-density lipoprotein and lipoprotein(a). I'll talk about Lp(a) in just a moment. So in the study, they decreased saturated fat from 28 grams to 20 grams, and they increased polyunsaturated fat from 11 to 19 grams. What happened? LDL went down, oxidized LDL and Lp(a) went up. How can anyone defend polyunsaturated fatty acids with that finding? This should be repeated. This should be shouted from the rooftops. And how can anyone be so myopically focused on LDL in absence or in exclusion of the context of oxidized LDL, Lp(a), which are much better predictors of cardiovascular risk than LDL itself? I don't understand. To me, this is travesty. It's super frustrating. So I know people want to know about my lipids. I just want to talk about a few more things here to really drive this point home. Here's a study showing that A1C is a hugely associated risk factor with cardiovascular disease. No surprise there. A1C is going to tell you about insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. Okay, what about this one? Let's show another study. Hyperinsulinemia is a predictor of new cardiovascular events in Colombian patients with a first myocardial infarction. No kidding. No shit. It's the most important factor. Conclusions. Hyperinsulinism was the most important factor associated to the occurrence of new cardiovascular patients in Colombian patients with acute myocardial infarction, which emphasizes the pivotal role of insulin resistance in the physiopathological mechanisms of atherosclerosis, especially in undeveloped countries. I'm reading from the abstract. Basically, in all countries, insulin resistance is the main driver of cardiovascular disease. If you are insulin sensitive, you are doing really well. But the problem is doctors are not checking this. They don't understand how to read fasting insulin reference ranges. This would change the face of modern medicine if we could educate physicians differently. That is one of my major goals. Nutrition is not taught in medical schools at all. Our doctors are well-intentioned and they're super intelligent, but they're not given the tools they need. I was never taught about fasting insulin in medical school until I was on an endocrinology rotation and I was looking at patients with type 1 diabetes. That is really the only context that I'm aware of in which fasting insulin is used as part of a craft assay, looking at the pancreas of a patient that is failing with type 1 diabetes. Very few people in the medical space are using fasting insulin as a contextual variable to make lifestyle and dietary changes. And very few physicians understand the importance of eliminating seed oils. They may understand the importance of eliminating processed sugars, but many physicians, including cardiologists, are recommending seed oils because they lower LDL. Is it any wonder people are still sick and fat and unhealthy? This is why I do the work I do. We got to change medicine. And we have to do that so that you and your family and your kids and your parents and their parents can get good information and make the appropriate lifestyle changes and not fear the most nutritious foods on the planet that allow humans to be fertile and vital and intelligent and clear thinking and kind and emotionally stable. Mental health is a whole separate thing. I'm so worried about what's happening in the world these days, and I want to do a podcast on it. Maybe I'll do something in the future. It's such a hot button issue, though. But I do think that the diet of our children influences their mental health and mental stability. And yet, we're telling kids to avoid meat and organs, the foods they need, the foods that their brains are shouting out for, often under the guise of cardiovascular disease risk associated with a faulty LDL paradigm. Do you guys wonder now why I harp on this so much? A couple more things before we move on from this topic. Reduced LDL particle size in children consuming a very low-fat diet is related to parental LDL subclass patterns. The reason I'm showing this study is to point out that there is some genetic predisposition to a pattern B in your lipids. That is a mostly small dense LDL pattern rather than a pattern A, which is mostly large buoyant. And when you give kids a low-fat, high carbohydrate diet, can you take any guesses as to what the high carbohydrate diet is? It's processed sugar. They express a pattern B. But the point here, again, yet another one, LDL subclass patterns, lipoprotein response to a low-fat, high carbohydrate diet in women. It has to do with their genetics. It doesn't have to do with saturated fat. It doesn't have to do with eating meat. It's the fact that if you have a genetic predisposition to a pattern B and you eat a junk food diet, you will get a pattern B. But I have a pattern A, like so many of you should and will when you eat this way. You will not get a pattern B unless you are eating garbage foods. If you are insulin sensitive, you will not develop a pattern B to your lipids. And I think that's good. But again, this B pattern is pointing us toward what? Insulin sensitivity metrics once more, which is why I started with my fasting insulin. That is the most important thing that doctors are not doing. I told you guys this would get a little technical. I wasn't lying. Let's go back to my blood work. So we talked about lipids. The only thing I want to say about Lp(a) is that you can lower Lp(a), yes, lower by eating more saturated fat. You can raise it by eating more polyunsaturated fatty acids. It does have a genetic basis. I think people with genetically high Lp(a) are often told that they need PCSK9 inhibitors or statins. I disagree with that. I think that there is some fluctuation in your Lp(a) based on your Lp(a). There's some fluctuation in your Lp(a) based on your diet. And lo and behold, saturated fat from animals lowers Lp(a). That's what I'll say. So inflammation, we know that red meat is inflammatory, right? Nope. My hsCRP is 0.5. Now, interestingly, when I had my blood work in the past that showed an LDL of 500, my hsCRP was 1.7. Now, that was basically 24 hours after one of the hardest workouts I've ever done. I went to ARX in Austin at the time. If you know about ARX, it's this computer program with these motors that pushes against you and finds your max effort. So you're just basically popping out all the veins in your neck and your face and just pushing as hard as you can. I've never been so sore in my life. I definitely had inflammation related to that muscle tearing, and that was showing in my HSCRP. I did a repeat HSCRP a few days later, and it was much lower, I think 0.7 or 0.5. But I wonder if the high LDL may have been related to that. I don't know how much research has been done in terms of fluctuations of LDL after extreme athletic events or healing, but I think it makes sense intuitively. I've got to believe that there is a reasonable hypothesis for LDL in the human body, that LDL is part of a delivery mechanism. We know it's an apolipoprotein. It's a bus that carries triglycerides and cholesterol, and it delivers it to the arterial wall sometimes. Now, many people believe that LDL delivery of cholesterol to the arterial wall is a pathogenic thing, and it shouldn't be doing that. The mainstream lipid pundits would say that the more LDL you have, the more LDL delivers that cholesterol to your arterial walls. But that is false, and we've seen that over and over and over. There are all these studies that those people are missing that show context that in people that have low triglycerides and high HDL and who are not hyperinsulinic, who are insulin sensitive, the amount of LDL you have is not geometrically or connected with the amount of atherosclerosis that you have in any way, shape, or form. This is what these people are missing over and over, and I look forward to discussions with them to discuss that. I've shown in the past that when I had that LDL of 500, I had a coronary artery calcium scan. Look, July 20th, 2020, same time. My coronary artery calcium score was zero. Now, people would say, you're too young. Well, I was 43 at the time. I have a father who had a angioplasty at 43. So I have a primary relative who had advanced cardiovascular disease at 43. Obviously, I believe he was insulin resistant. And I have zero calcium in my arteries with an LDL of 500 at the time and an LDL 300 to 400 for the years leading up to that. Almost all cardiac radiologists who look at CT coronary angiograms would say that I should have calcification in my arteries at those levels of LDL for years leading up to that coronary calcium scan that showed CTA, that showed a CAC score of 0. Again, that is my N of 1, but we see it over and over and over in these lipid circles that just because you have a high LDL does not mean that there's a concentration-based effect of that LDL getting pushed into the arterial wall. There's something else going on. And I believe that something else is insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction. What role does that play? Here's the deal. Again, I'm getting deep in the lipids, then I'm going to move on to the rest of my labs. We don't get atherosclerosis in our veins because the veins are a low pressure system. Atherosclerosis only happens in high pressure systems. What does high pressure have to do with arteries? It denudes, it scrapes off, it damages the endothelium, the inside of your arteries. And then something must repair that. In all of us, that's happening. Even in me, in you. An insulin sensitive person is going to get damage to their arteries because of the high flow, the 120 millimeters of mercury that it takes to pump the blood from my heart to my limbs, to my brain, to my arms, to my legs, everything. That's damaging to the arteries, and your body has to repair that. I believe there's a very compelling hypothesis here that LDL is part of the repair mechanism, and that people who have insulin resistance are not doing as good repair. We know that people who have diabetes get gangrenous feet. They don't circulate well. They don't repair wounds as well. The immune system is impaired. So I believe there's a really interesting idea here that we need to test more, that in people who have insulin resistance, that repair process in the arteries is impaired. So LDL is sending cholesterol to those arteries, but that cholesterol is getting accumulated there because of a potential holdup in the repair process because of impairments in the immune system related to that hyperinsulinemia and metabolic dysfunction. Again, this is a hypothesis that needs to be tested, but I think it makes sense in the broader context of what's going on there. It's important to note and to emphasize one more time, I do not believe for 1 second that there is enough evidence to say confidently, and I believe there's a lot of evidence to the contrary, that LDL moving into arterial walls is a concentration-based effect, or that LDL is directly toxic to the endothelium. I don't think those have ever been shown clearly in the medical literature. Okay, you guys can tell I get fired up when I talk about lipids. My HSCRP is now 0.5. Okay, so there's no inflammation. Meat is inflammatory. No, it's not. Homocysteine. I want to talk about this one for one moment. Again, this may get a little complex here. Homocysteine is something I've talked about in the past. I've done entire podcasts on homocysteine and on MTHFR. I am Italian. I am homozygous for the 677C to T polymorphism in the MTHFR gene, which is part of this methionine or folate cycle. You can see here dietary folate not folic acid. That is not occurring in nature. It is tetrahydrofolate or methylfolate or adenylyl folate come in through the diet. Okay. They end up as tetrahydrofolate. There's a series of enzymatic reactions which turn them into 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate. That is acted upon by MTHFR, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, which needs riboflavin, that is B2 and B3, and DHA, according to this diagram, docosahexaenoic acid, and that makes 5-methylfolate. Now, in those of us, Italians, Hispanics tend to have this polymorphism. This MTHFR enzyme doesn't work really well, or it works more slowly, which means we either need to get more folate into our bodies, or we need to find some source of L-methylfolate, or we need to get more riboflavin. So this is a really important thing. At the time of this blood work, I was traveling. I wasn't getting as much liver as I usually do, and I wasn't eating as many egg yolks as I usually do. This is probably why my homocysteine bumped. The last few homocysteines I've seen have been 7 when I'm eating enough raw liver per day, an ounce, half an ounce a day. That keeps my homocysteine at 7 with no supplementation of L-methylfolate in my diet. Now, is homocysteine the end all and be all of the cardiovascular risk equation? No, it's not. We don't fully understand it, I don't think, but I think it is an important thing to know about. And if your homocysteine, I believe, is over 8, I would increase the amount of riboflavin in your diet. Where do you get riboflavin? Liver and heart are the best sources of riboflavin. It's a good review paper I found, The Current Status of Homocysteine as a Risk Factor for Cardiovascular Disease. A mini review is from 2018. And you can see here in the abstract, they say that treatment of hyperhomocysteinemia with folic acid, that should be folate, folic acid is bullshit, and B vitamins, specifically riboflavin, but also B3, prevents the development, B3 is niacin, prevents the development of atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, and strokes. So it is important to treat an elevated homocysteine. And I've seen homocysteines as high as 18 or 20 in people who are very low on folate or riboflavin because they're not eating enough of these things. Now, there's some controversy about how much cardiovascular effect it has, but I've seen very clear responses in my diet to more organs and a little more egg yolks. My homocysteine, I want to see it below 8. I was talking to a friend this morning. He said his dad's homocysteine is 12 or more. What does his dad do? His dad does basically a carnivore diet of just meat. Of course, your homocysteine is going to be 12 if you have polymorphisms in the MTHFR enzyme. I think that this is an indication that more organs like heart and liver should be added back to the diet, either desiccated or fresh. Fresh is always best. If you don't want to do fresh, you can always check us out at heartandsoilsupplements.co. Moving on with my blood work, you can see fibrinogen, which is another inflammatory marker, is within the normal range at 271. Their reference range goes up to 391. Meat is not inflammatory, guys. It's not even really worth talking about much beyond that. Free fatty acids are 0.12. Now, when I've done ketogenic versions of a carnivore diet, my free fatty acids were significantly higher. This is because I was fueled by fat. They're non-esterified fatty acids. This is physiologic insulin resistance in a human. If you're on a ketogenic diet, your free fatty acids will be higher. Mine are low because I'm eating plenty of carbohydrates. Their cutoff is 0.6 for low to moderate risk. I believe mine were around 0.6 on a ketogenic carnivore diet. Again, this is an indication also of insulin resistance, which is why they use it. Because what we know is that when your fat cells become insulin resistant, insulin's action at the level of fat cell cannot turn off lipolysis, and you get non-esterified fatty acids flooding into the blood. That is an indicator of insulin resistance. Now, again, we're right back to insulin resistance. You can know how insulin sensitive you are with a fasting insulin test. My omega index, this was part of the panel. You can see that according to their reference ranges, my EPA and DHA are within normal, as is my arachidonic acid. But my omega-3 index, they say, is in the moderate. Now, I'm just going to say this gently. The omega-3 index is bullshit. It's based on epidemiology. And I think that the epidemiology, it's based on looks at people in Japan who have higher levels of omega-3 in their blood and red blood cells and says, oh, these people do better. Well, it's epidemiology. So we must not forget that they could just be doing other health behaviors rather than the omega-3 being beneficial for them. In many studies, omega-3 is beneficial, but I think the main benefits are in attenuating the damages of omega-6. I think one of the problems with omega-6 is that omega-3 and omega-6 share the same series of elongase and desaturase enzymes. And that when you have lots of omega-6, things like linoleic acid, an 18-carbon omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, you are going to gum up those synthetic mechanisms for omega-3s. Humans need some EPA and DHA. Again, not eating a ton of egg yolks at the time. They could be a little higher in my blood work, and they probably will be now that I'm back in Costa Rica, getting more egg yolks, 2 a day, maybe 3. I'm really trying to find low linoleic acid egg yolks, chickens that are not fed corn and soy, but it's really hard. Forthcoming more on that. But I think that one of the main problems with linoleic acid is it causes omega-3 deficiency. We need a small amount of these molecules. So I think that when you give omega-3 to people, it may benefit them because it's giving them something they can't make, because most of the population is full of omega-6s. I don't think omega-3 is that valuable on its own, though. And I don't think excess amounts of omega-3 are a very good idea for any humans at all. I've spoken about this in the past, guys. I would not recommend massive omega-3 supplementation. Here's a very interesting editorial, 2019, in this is from JAMA. Omega-3 fatty acids and atrial fibrillation. And you can see here the author, Gregory Kerfman, notes 4 trials: the strength trial, the reduce it trial, the OMEMI trial, and the vital rhythm study. And he says, considered together, the data from the 4 trials suggest, but do not prove, there may be a dose-related risk of atrial fibrillation with omega-3 fatty acid intake. At a dose of 4 grams per day, there was a highly statistically significant increased risk in risk, nearly a doubling. With an intermediate dose of 1.8 grams per day, the increase in risk did not achieve statistical significance. But the omega-3 pundits, the omega-3 proselytizers will go on podcasts like Rogan's and say 4 grams of omega-3 is what you need per day. But in these 4 trials, there was a statistically significant increase in the risk of atrial fibrillation, a very negative heart arrhythmia having to do with the left atrium, which can lead to blood clots, which can go to your brain. Not a good thing. You don't want atrial fibrillation at doses of 4 grams per day of omega-3 fatty acids. That's not really something that humans should be doing, guys, especially not from fish oil supplements that are oxidized. And I don't think that's a good thing. Yet another study, I'm going to kick omega-3s a little further down. This is a animal study, dietary fatty acids and oxidative stress in the heart mitochondria. The rats were fed for 16 weeks coconut, olive, or fish oil diet. The fish oil diet led to the highest oxidative stress in cardiac mitochondria, an effect that could partly be prevented by the antioxidant probucol. So you do not want to be pushing lots of omega-3s in your diet. I think those calling for excess omega-3s, lots of omega-3s in the diet, need to answer to those concerns of mine and many others. If you get omega-3s in your animal fat, that's fine. Tallow has omega-3s in it. It's fine. It's a small amount. Eggs have a little bit of DHA and EPA. Fine. Do not take fish oil supplements. This is not a reason to eat fish. If you listen to this podcast regularly, you know that even a few weeks ago, I talked about an epidemiology study that showed an association between fish consumption and melanoma risk. And no one is talking about that. It probably has to do with the PCBs, the heavy metals, and other contaminants in fish. Fish is bullshit, in my opinion, guys. It's better than kale, but put a lot in your diet and you're going to accumulate those toxins. And I think you're going to increase your risk of melanoma and potentially atrial fibrillation. But fish oil supplements, garbage, throw them away. So you can see here, my omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, fine. They're saying my EPA to arachidonic acid ratio is low, but if you look at their reference range, I'm at 0.1. Anything greater than 0.2 is fine. I think it's kind of a silly test. They probably want my EPA to be a little higher than it is. I'm totally fine with an EPA of 1.4 according to their levels. And my arachidonic acid is fine. They say the low risk range is 5.2 to 12.9. I'm at 11.2. Arachidonic acid has many valuable things in the human body. So insulin, A1C, glucose, we talked about that. Let's talk about thyroid briefly. My TSH, 1.16. All the thyroid is good. Thyroid has not always been good, especially when I was eating ketogenic diet. What I've talked about in the past is that we know that if you have a ketogenic diet, your free T3 is going to go in the toilet. Your free T4 might go in the toilet, but your TSH is not always going to bump. I don't think we fully understand why this happens, but you can also see that my reverse T3, which is an indicator of stress, is normal. It's 10. I think this is a full thyroid panel. You want all of this. But if you are doing a ketogenic diet, your thyroid is a little bit hurting. And my subjective experience on a low carb, a zero carb carnivore diet was that I was cold. I was living in San Diego and I was always a little cold. I feel much better now that I've added back carbohydrates to my diet, as I've spoken about. Again, hopefully podcasts coming, talking about my concerns with a ketogenic diet in the near future, but thyroid is just one of those concerns. Cortisol, AM cortisol, fine. We talked about insulin, IGF-1. People will often look at a diet that's high in meat and say it's going to spike your IGF-1. My IGF-1 is less than the average American. You can see the Z-score means I'm 1/2 standard deviation below the norm. In fact, I believe when I was on a carnivore diet, my IGF-1 was 90. So this is only slightly higher. I would challenge anyone in the health space who thinks that I'm going to raise my IGF-1 by eating 2 pounds of meat per day to show me what their IGF-1 is. I bet it's going to be higher than mine. Let's look at my hormones. Everyone loves to know what my hormones are. My estradiol is 33. I think estrogen has beneficial effects in men. You obviously don't want it to be too high, but you need some estradiol in your life. You don't just want to take an aromatase inhibitor and annihilate that. You'll see negative changes in your lipids. Progesterone is just low because I'm a male. FSH and LH are hormones coming from my pituitary, which signal to my testicles to make testosterone. You can see my free testosterone, 80.5, and my total testosterone is 700. This is about where it's been for the last few years, except when I'm on a ketogenic diet, my testosterone drops to around 500. Again, hormonal changes on a ketogenic diet. Now my testosterone is, I would say, more in a healthy range. Interestingly, my SHBG is 68. My last sex hormone binding globulin was 54 or 56, I believe. But when you dig into SHBG, what you find is that perhaps this is not something you always check when you are fasting. This is one blood draw that I did when I was fasting because I had to get fasting lipids. But SHBG is probably something you should check when you are not fasting. Now, why is that? Because insulin lowers sex hormone binding globulin. This is why my sex hormone binding globulin was very high when I did a ketogenic diet. It's been as high as 112 or 120, which led to free testosterone levels that were significantly lower than what I had now. Again, yet another reason that I'm not a huge fan of ketogenic diets. Your SHBG will likely skyrocket because you need some insulin to drive that down. I think my postprandial or midday SHBG would be much lower than this 68. Again, this is significantly lower now that I'm having carbohydrates, but this is after an overnight fast. So my hormones are great. I feel good. Libido is good. All these things are in line. And you can see that the LH and FSH, my pituitary, is signaling to my testicles to make testosterone. One of the things that I love to talk about is the fact that I've never taken exogenous testosterone, no drugs, no hormones. You can see that pretty clearly on my labs right here, because if I were taking TRT, my FSH and LH would be suppressed. So not a perfect indicator, but I want to show you guys that I'm a man of my word. I'm not taking TRT. In fact, one of my good friends asks me this all the time. Whenever I talk to Andrew Huberman, he says, "Are you taking TRT?" And I'm saying, no. It's kind of a compliment because I think he's noticing that I'm muscular and I maintain muscle, and that many 45-year-olds my age would take TRT to get to this level. I don't have a problem with that as long as you understand why your testosterone is low in the first place. I'm a 45-year-old male. My testosterone is 700. I think it probably even could have been higher than that. I had a shitty night of sleep before these labs, and I bet in general it's even a little higher than 700. I'll get some more blood work in the future and see if I can get another level of testosterone to triangulate this with, but it's been pretty stable in that level. I bounce back and forth. I go to 500 when I'm keto. Again, I don't do keto anymore, but 700-ish. I think the last one in 2020 was 750 or 740 when I am on a animal-based diet. Yet another benefit of having carbohydrates in your diet. Some people may look at the estradiol and think you want it to be lower. I think that if you look at the medians for estradiol in men, you find that I'm right in the normal range. And if you look at the role of estradiol in male reproductive function, there are roles. It tends to have some sort of a delicate dance appropriate with hormones. With testosterone, I'll let you guys look at these articles if you have more interest. The role of estradiol in male reproductive function is a good summary review article, and age-specific serum, total, and free estradiol concentrations in healthy men in U.S. nationally representative samples. When you look at those, you'll find that my estradiol is totally within the normal and right about the median in both of those. And I think that's totally fine. I definitely don't have gynecomastia, as you can see by any of my Instagram videos. I mentioned Lp(a) earlier. I want to circle back to this for a moment because there's a really interesting article that I did find about this. LP(a) in dietary proteins, casein lowers LP(a) as compared with soy protein. Vegans, eat your heart out. Soy protein had a negative effect on LP(a). Casein, which is in milk, seemed to lower LP(a). Yet another reason to try and include some raw dairy in your diet. You guys can read the abstract if you're interested in that one. So let's go back to my labs. Liver function tests, all fine. AST, ALT were 26 and 27 respectively. No, eating a lot of meat doesn't fry your liver. Alkaline phosphatase, bilirubin, albumin, total protein, globulin ratio, normal. Not a whole lot to note here other than the fact that my liver is just fine, thank you, and thriving. My kidney health, my creatinine was 1.09. I do carry a lot of muscle. I do eat a lot of meat. Sometimes you guys will see an elevated creatinine eating a lot of meat. In that case, I would get a cystatin C to triangulate. My GFR, my glomerular filtration rate is fine. You'll see my albumin is here. You'll note that my BUN is flagged. On the morning of this blood work, I was pretty dehydrated. I was staying in a hotel. I didn't have any spring water, and I wasn't going to drink tap water from the hotel in Northern Virginia. So this is dehydration primarily in terms of my BUN being there. Probably also a little bit higher in general because I eat a lot of meat. Electrolytes, sodium, potassium, chloride, carbon dioxide, calcium, totally fine. There's no metabolic acidosis here from all the meat. My carbon dioxide is 29. Bone health. This is an interesting one. My 25 hydroxy vitamin D was 75. That's just from the sun, guys. On as much of my body as I can. I definitely tan naked when I can here in Costa Rica. I've got a calcium of 9.2 and again, an alkaline phosphatase of 71. So 25 hydroxy vitamin D, 75, that's the highest I've ever had it. No supplementation there. Blood counts, just I think it's in general beneficial to get CBCs and Chem 7s or Chem 14s, comprehensive metabolic panels on all of your stuff. Platelets, normal, white blood cell counts, neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils, all normal. You can see here my red blood cells are a little bit high. This is probably some hemo concentration from dehydration that morning, consistent with the BUN, though my hematocrit's pretty high. They didn't flag it, but I think that in general, I probably run on the high end of hematocrit. I guess might have to do with breath holding related to surfing, or just the fact that I'm a fit human. I want to repeat this hematocrit and see what it will be with a little more hydration during the morning. My previous hematocrits have been 46 or so. So this may be some hemo concentration. Again, you can see MCV, which gives you an indication of the size of the red blood cells. When that's off, you think about folate or iron or B12 deficiency, those type of things. Iron, this is an interesting one. So iron, there's a lot of iron in organs like liver and heart and muscle meat. My serum iron is normal. My ferritin is 177, totally normal, but probably in the middle of the range for most people. You don't want a low ferritin because that leads to anemia. My total iron binding capacity is within normal, but on the low end because I have a lot of iron. Generally, people will your body will adjust the amount of iron coming in. I'm not sure if this iron saturation is accurate because I've done iron panels in the past and it's been 24. I don't have hemochromatosis. I know this based on 23andMe data, which is not always perfect, but I've done it multiple times. I do not have hemochromatosis. My liver enzymes are normal. I want to repeat my iron saturation and see if it's always 54. In the past, it's been 24. My ferritin always kind of hangs in this range. This is to say that you don't really need to worry about iron, in my opinion, if you're eating lots of meat and organs, if you don't have hemochromatosis. Now, some people do have hemochromatosis. You need to know about that. You need to check your iron. Sometimes a high iron saturation is an indication of hemochromatosis, but ultimately it's a genetic test to tell you what's going on with that marker. The treatment is up to your physician, but often includes phlebotomy. But again, if I had a hemochromatosis, this ferritin would likely be quite elevated. And on my genetic testing, you can do 23andMe. You can get your raw data. You can put it into a program called Promethease.com. And then you can see what polymorphisms you have. I've done that program in the past. I am ApoE33. Like I said, I have 677C to T MTHFR. And you can see that you do or do not have mutations in the HFE gene, which is the main gene involved in hereditary hemochromatosis. So I think that iron saturation of 54 warrants a repeat and just to keep an eye on that. For me, if you guys feel differently, let me know in the comments, but I'm curious about that one moving forward. Again, I've had it at 24 or 26 in the past. I'm sure about that. I'll go back to the July 2020 labs to show you guys my ferritin was 276. My iron saturation was 26 at the time. Total iron binding capacity was about the same. So I don't know why it's 54 now. The ferritin is actually lower now. I want to repeat it and keep track of it. Again, this is that 1.7 HSCRP I was mentioning when I had the post-workout soreness. But the labs from 2020 were pretty similar in many of these metrics. You can see my fasting insulin was less than 3 then, and I showed the lipids earlier. And then I will show a few more from 2020 just for context for you guys. My hematocrit was 44.8, and that's the end of those labs from 2020. There's actually, I'll show you guys a TMAO and a uric acid in one moment from 2020. Back to the end of my blood work. This time, my folate, normal, 12.4. We've seen the 25 hydroxy vitamin D before, B12, 769, no surprise there. RBC magnesium within normal. I do not supplement with magnesium. Many people would say you're not going to get enough magnesium on this diet. Bullshit. It's not about how much magnesium you get, or it is partially about how much magnesium you get. It's also about how much you retain and how much you absorb. I'm not eating any foods with oxalates or phytic acid to prevent the absorption of magnesium in my body. So I think that it's not surprising that my RBC magnesium is just fine. You do not need to supplement with magnesium on an animal-based diet, in my opinion. That is bullshit. You should not be losing magnesium in your diet if you are eating an animal-based diet or if you are insulin sensitive. So that is the end of my blood work from this most recent lab. One of the things I noticed that I was bummed about was the fact that this Wellness FX panel did not have uric acid, and I figured you guys would probably want to see that one as well. So I will refer back to the July 2020 labs where I had a uric acid. You can see the uric acid is 3.9 in July of 2020. That's eating a lot of honey. I believe the technical term is shitload of honey. Eating a lot of honey and fructose will not raise your uric acid, nor will fruit. That's been shown many a time over and over. I will get a uric acid and share that result with you guys in the future. But I do not expect it to be anywhere over 4. There's been a lot of people talking recently about problems with uric acid and avoiding organ meats. Well, guess what? In 2020, I ate a lot of organ meats and a lot of honey. My uric acid was totally fine. I think uric acid is, again, elevations in uric acid are primarily related to insulin resistance. You guys may have noticed on the last lab, the TMAO was slightly flagged. Again, I've done TMAO podcasts in the past. That is the most bullshit metric there is. There's no good evidence that TMAO itself is harmful to humans. Refer back to previous podcasts if you worry about TMAO. I've seen carnivores with TMAOs that are high, carnivores with TMAOs that are low. I've seen vegans and vegetarians with high TMAOs. It probably has to do with your gut flora. And TMAO comes from choline, carnitine, very valuable substances for humans. But there are so much bullshit thrown around about TMAO. It drives me absolutely freaking crazy. Do not worry about TMAO if you are insulin sensitive. So that is my recent blood work. I hope that is all helpful. I hope it's not too technical. That's the way I think about blood work in general. None of this should be taken as medical advice. Talk to your doctor about your blood work. But the most important takeaway here is know what your insulin sensitivity is. Get rid of seed oils and processed sugars in your diet. Do not fear red meat. Do not fear organs. Get organs in your diet. I get liver. I get heart every single day. I get egg yolks a lot of days. I'm going to get testicles very frequently and get them fresh or desiccated like we make at Heart and Soil Supplements, heartandsoil.co. But as you can see, I think there's a lot of deep discussions here regarding LDL and a lot of ways that we can improve the medical system and the way we think about blood work. I love doing that stuff. I love geeking out about it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that one. Again, I'll share my uric acid in a future podcast at the beginning of the podcast because that one was missed. And let me know in the comments what you guys think about this one. If you think this is valuable, please share with friends and family who need to understand that there's a lot being missed in mainstream medical establishment. And I think we are a part of changing the future of that. And I think that leads to better health for all of our friends and family.